The 1960s and Johnson's presidency. Lyndon Baines Johnson would finish the presidency the last year of Kennedy's term of office and run for presidency himself. He promised a great society. That was his campaign slogan. He was going to make America a great society. In terms of his domestic agenda, he was going to declare war on poverty. With the help of Congress, the Johnson presidency declared war on poverty. Specifically attempts to do that by creating the Office of Economic Opportunity. The Office of Economic Opportunity would oversee a number of programs that would spend money on projects to help some of the neediest people in America. Some of the areas that were the most impoverished in America. It's what it took on. Another element of his war on poverty, getting Congress to pass the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, where the federal government, which has always given some money to schools, but most of the money comes from the states. But under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the federal government gave $1 billion to public schools in some of the poorest areas of America. Because something that was common is in rich areas in America, the public schools were better funded. So this was an effort to try to even that out. $1 billion given to some of the poorest schools in America. Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Under Johnson's presidency, he also created Head Start, which was preschool for poor families. Still an element run today. Early childhood education for poor families. In 1965, he got Congress to pass the Medicare Act, which was a law that was health insurance for the elderly. Remember, Social Security was a government-sponsored retirement system. Johnson, and someone considered this a socialistic act, just like that was, got Congress to pass the Medicare Act of 1965. It was government health care for the elderly. Now that is also done through a tax on your income, on your payroll tax. In the same year, he would get Congress to pass Medicaid. That was government health care for people living in poverty. Government health care for people living in poverty. We can see significant acts in the war on poverty. He also created the Department of Housing and Urban Development to try to get more affordable housing for the poor. He had significant accomplishments in his war on poverty. You can always argue that some of it was socialistic, but he really upheld the war on poverty. When it came to civil rights, there was also some significant accomplishments when it came to civil rights. Well, he tried to correct the injustices, the discrimination of immigration policy of the 1920s. And he got Congress to approve the Immigration Act of 1965, which ended the quota system. applied to certain nations. Immigration would continue on a more equitable basis. Remember the National Origins Act of the 1920s, it discriminated against nations from Eastern Europe. Well, the Immigration Act of 1965 ended that. It was a more equitable immigration policy. We would not discriminate against certain nations. In 1964, with Congress, we passed the 24th Amendment. A big accomplishment. This officially abolished poll taxes in federal elections. Because remember, the poll taxes hurt the poor and hurt the African Americans the most. In 1924, Congress passed the 24th Amendment, ended poll taxes in federal elections. In the same year, he accomplished what the vision of JFK, of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Congress passed the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, which would end segregation. End segregation in businesses that were involved in interstate commerce. Civil Rights Bill of 1964 would end segregation in businesses that engage in interstate commerce. So this was a big step in ending segregation in America. And just to give you some example, it applied to hotels, restaurants, sporting arenas, and theaters. This was a major accomplishment as far as the federal government saying segregation is wrong and we're overturning it. Now, there were earlier civil rights bills concerning voting, but they were not very strong. And in the South, African Americans still no longer had the protections they needed to vote and to have representation. In 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. organized the famous March from Selma to Montgomery. They got national attention. The movie Selma was based on this event, encouraging Congress and the president to pass a much stronger, a much more effective bill that would protect their voting rights. With that pressure, Congress passed the landmark Voting Rights Act of 1965. That gave them a lot of protection. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, it also outlawed literacy exams. It allowed the federal government to send examiners, people to examine the elections and make sure they were done openly and fair. With the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, African Americans came out in large numbers to vote. It's estimated that within 3 years, over 740,000 African Americans began voting in the South. So the impact was huge. African American leaders were voted into office. And white leaders had to now listen to the African Americans because they were now a strong voting bloc in America. Another strategy in dealing with segregation, the oppression of African Americans, a strategy in giving them, I would say, more for economic opportunity began under Johnson's presidency. And it was the practice of affirmative action, the controversial practice of affirmative action. Affirmative action was this practice of only doing business, of only giving funds to businesses or to schools that set aside positions for people of color, like quotas for people of color. Now, the intention of affirmative action is to give African Americans and women, by the way, who also were affected by affirmative action, more access to jobs. Affirmative action was also used in universities. When a university accepted students, giving a quota, a set amount of incoming freshman spots to women or people of color. The federal government would give universities that did that, additional funding. The negative part of that, the criticism of that, is that whites that could even demonstrate more qualifications would be turned away. They would be left out. Some argue that affirmative action was a form of reverse discrimination. You're denying the rights of a qualified white person to give opportunities to a person of color. You're giving them the position just because of their color. This was a practice that would be done through the 60s through the early 70s, again, designed to give African Americans and women more economic opportunities. Well, the result of affirmative action that began under Johnson, even though it's a decade later, it's kind of like an end result of affirmative action. The Bakke case took place in 1978. Bakke was a candidate for medical school, a white man that was not accepted. The University of Davis in Sacramento, California. He was not accepted, and he argued he was more qualified than people of color that got accepted. And the argument was reverse discrimination. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Bakke, saying that nationality or race alone cannot be a factor in these outcomes, in hiring people or giving spots to people in schools. Also under Johnson's presidency, the Supreme Court, and we're talking Earl Warren, lots of civil rights, people of color. In one of their rulings, they mandated that the governments begin to integrate their schools using forced busing. The Supreme Court made a ruling that the government make an attempt to integrate schools through forced busing. That there were too many public schools that were separated by race, and that governments should begin a process of integrating schools by forced busing. Right here in Brawley, I went through elementary schools that did that. I took a bus from my side of town across the city of Brawley as a result of this push to integrate schools. Forced busing that took place in 1968. Now, in the 1960s, it wasn't just about Martin Luther King Jr. He was the face of the civil rights movement in the 50s. In the 60s, before his death, we saw another approach to civil rights taking place. We saw some African American organizations that took a different philosophy. They took a philosophy of separation, empowerment, and some advocated the use of violence. So this slide has to do with the rise of Black power and racial violence. It took place at the same time. So Black separatism, again, was an approach and ideology that began in the 1960s. And we would have different organizations that practiced separatism. They didn't want white Americans in their groups. They wanted to separate. One of those organizations was the Nation of Islam, which was an organization of African Americans that practiced Islam. One of their spokespersons, not their leader, but one of their spokespersons. The man that got national attention was one Malcolm X. There's a picture of him over here to the right. He openly criticized Martin Luther King Jr. in the nonviolent practices, etc. He preached that African Americans, when threatened, should take up arms and resist. And he said, he referred to whites as devils, and he believed in the separation of races. Common in the 1960s civil rights group was this notion of black power, which means black empowerment. And another group that we would see that would preach black empowerment, coming out of Oakland, California, the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party also believed in, if need be, violent resistance. Now, the Black Panther Party, some of its leaders, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, their organization was out there trying to empower and help the impoverished, especially in the city of Oakland. But they also got involved in some firefights, into violence in the streets with police officers. You see a picture over here as well. The 60s, the clashing and the fight for civil rights also led to riots in certain cities. The most famous in California, 1965, the Watts riots. It resulted in deaths and all kinds of damage. The city was on fire in 1965. Another event, not up here in terms, but kind of symbolic of this era, 1968 Olympics, 2 American track athletes protested or wanted to get attention to black empowerment. John Carlos, Tommy Smith, that's their names. When they played the national anthem, they put their heads down and they raised their fist with a black glove on it. A type of national anthem protest. We've heard of this before. 68. Again, they were protesting the segregation, the treatment of African Americans, and black empowerment. In 1968, Johnson put a federal commission to investigate the violence in the American cities concerning race. It was called the Kerner Commission in 1968. To investigate the riots in the cities, American cities. And while the Kerner Commission took no action, the outcome of the commission, they concluded, is that African Americans felt powerless in a society dominated by whites. They did recommend eliminating barriers to jobs, education, and housing. Basically, they recommended more economic opportunity and more communication between racial lines. In the 60s, and predominantly whites, we're talking middle to upper class whites, we also are going to see a new sort of political movement take place, social and political movement. The rise of the new left, and we're talking very liberal Americans, also known as the counterculture. Middle to upper class white Americans, these baby boomers, that once they got to the end of high school and college, they had very liberal thinking, and they, again, countercultural, went against traditional ideas. The new left, sometimes called hippies. But in some elements of this hippie movement, they were organized, such as the Students for a Democratic Society was a political group of the new left, or the counterculture. Its home was Berkeley, University of Berkeley, California. And politically, this group was calling for freedom of speech. They were really talking for a lot about freedom of speech. Politically, a lot of the New Left supported the civil rights movement. Also politically, as we get into it, they're going to be very much against the war in Vietnam. That's what we remember about the counterculture of the New Left. Young, middle to wealthy Americans engaged in freedom of speech, supporting civil rights, anti-Vietnam War, and socially, again, this liberation against traditional ideas. They're also known for their unique style of dress, experimenting with drugs. Marijuana was the most common. This is what gave it that element of the counterculture. A perfect example of the counterculture was Woodstock. Concert in upstate New York that got national attention. Some of America's greatest musicians took place. 1969. People like Jimi Hendrix, Santana, Janis Joplin. And some refer to this event as an event, a number of days of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. When it comes to civil rights is not just is rights in general for society. And civil rights doesn't always have to be people of color. But another event that took place in this liberal time was the rights of people that were accused of a crime. We're going to see those accused of a crime, their rights expanded under Earl Warren and the Supreme Court. So we talk about civil rights under the Warren Court. We talked about in terms of people of color and their rights to public school. That was Brown versus the Board of Education. But we're also going to have more rights for the people accused of a crime, more rights in our criminal justice system. Gideon versus Wainwright, that was the first Supreme Court case that someone accused of a crime had the right to a lawyer. Gideon versus Wainwright. This was the first Supreme Court case that someone accused of a crime had the right to a lawyer, even if they could not afford it. And you can see how this is an issue of civil rights, because people that were impoverished, people that are uneducated, with not being aware of their rights, without knowing the legal system, they were easy victims. So this is a civil rights issue. This is for those accused of a crime, right to a lawyer, even if they could not afford one. In 1964, Escobedo versus Illinois is also the right to a lawyer, but at any time, as soon as you're accused, as soon as they ask you to come in for questioning, you had the rights to a lawyer. So that had to deal with when you had the rights to a lawyer. Basically, in Escobedo versus Illinois, as soon as you were accused of a crime, as soon as you were brought in for questioning, you had the rights to a lawyer. They could not pursue unless you had a lawyer. Of course, you had to ask for it, specifically ask for it. And the most famous of these criminal justice cases, the most famous of the rights for people accused of a crime, Miranda versus Arizona in 1966. This was the Supreme Court case that determined when someone was arrested, they had to be read their rights. When someone was arrested, they had to be informed of their rights. This is Miranda, the man that was arrested and the Supreme Court case decided his rights were violated. His constitutional rights were violated. He should have been read his rights. They made cards that police officers would carry and, of course, memorize. The Miranda card, the Miranda rights, named after the man accused of this crime. So those are the steps. That's how the Warren Court is remembered, a champion of civil rights for people of color and for the rights of the accused, or people in a criminal justice system. Understand, with the fight for civil rights of African Americans and with the involvement of the New Left in the counterculture, this movement would expand beyond just African Americans. Women felt more emboldened in the 1960s to fight for more rights and to get society to respect women more. Betty Friedan, who became the leader of NOW, the National Organization for Women, Betty Friedan she is not the leader of the National Organization for Women's Rights. Betty Friedan, though, is symbolic of the women's rights movement because she wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique in 1963 that criticized the cult of domesticity, that criticized the traditional role of women, arguing that women can achieve and do so much more in society. Okay. In terms of women's rights, Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, a book that criticized the cult of domesticity. The organization in the 60s that developed, that was created for women's rights issues was called NOW, and it still exists today, the National Organization for Women, whose goal it was, again, is to give women the equal rights of men. In 1967, NOW campaigned for an equal rights amendment. In 1967, NOW campaigned for an equal rights amendment, something in the Constitution that would give women the same status as men. Interesting enough, you would think in the 60s this was a perfect time. There was a very liberal spirit, that this would be a perfect time to get such an amendment passed. However, ERA failed in 1967. And the group really responsible for help to end the idea of ERA, the group responsible for blocking ERA was women, conservative women. Conservative women led by Phyllis Schlafly. She led conservative women to block the passing of ERA. She organized conservative women to block ERA. She was afraid of such things as, with an equal rights amendment, women might be required to enter the draft. She wanted to keep the protections that women had in the legal system, like when women are divorced and they get alimony, etc. So she led conservative women to defeat ERA in 1967. Women's rights, those that supported women's rights, or the term feminist is what you would call it. To them, they also got a victory in a Supreme Court case that took place in 1973. Again, considered a victory for feminists or those in favor of women's rights in 1973. With a Supreme Court case that got national attention, Roe versus Wade. This was a Supreme Court case that legalized abortion. The Supreme Court case that legalized abortion, or left it up to the states to decide, that the federal government would not make abortion illegal. The 60s and the New Left, and it was a time to fight for rights, like we said. We have other examples in the 60s of minorities fighting for rights. There were farm workers in the western part of the United States that decided to organize that wanted the same rights as industrial workers did in the factories, because they did not have the same rights, especially to bargain collectively, to sit down and make contracts. So then we're going to see the rise of the labor leader, Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez would be the leader of the United Farm Workers Association. And their goals, and a lot of what they accomplished, was the rights to unionize, the rights to improve the conditions for farm workers. It was mostly Mexicans or Mexican Americans and Filipinos, especially in places throughout California and Arizona. Cesar Chavez was a famous union leader of the United Farm Workers Association. Helped to negotiate contracts to improve their working conditions. Native Americans were also active in the 1960s. They put together an organization known as the American Indian Movement. They also wanted more opportunities in the reservations, economic opportunities. And they got national attention by sit-ins, by occupying government buildings. AIM is responsible for at one point occupying the prison, the now retired prison of Alcatraz in 1969. And then AIM was responsible for the occupation of a government building at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. Unfortunately, that one ended with violence, as you can see down here. When we look at the legacy of Johnson, we think of his Great Society. What was his Great Society? We think of his war on poverty. And again, all of these elements can be argued, but there's a lot you can argue to how, probably more so than any other president, he helped Congress to pass laws to help the impoverished, how he, more than any other president, actually got laws in terms of civil rights legislation, effective civil rights legislation. There's a lot to his, you might say that affirmative action was an overstep. Maybe they went too far, you can argue that. Unfortunately, when you look at his foreign policy, that'll be next, most agree that the decisions concerning Vietnam were very bad. So when we look at the 60s, together with the last lecture, let's take a look at Kennedy. To what extent did Kennedy stop the spread of communism? What was his foreign policy like? To what extent was Kennedy a champion of the civil rights movement? What did he do to further civil rights? And then we do this something similar with number 5. To what extent did Johnson's presidency help the impoverished and minorities in America? And number 6, to what extent did the Warren Court further civil rights in America?